The macabre story of the man who survived the harshest winter in the history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is there. We read every single one. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into the story. There are winters that people forget. Seasons that come and go like unremarkable guests, leaving behind nothing but muddy roads and the memory of gray skies. And then there are winters that carve themselves into the bones of a place, into the memory of every man, woman, and child who endured them. Winters so brutal, so relentless, so utterly indifferent to human suffering that generations later, people still speak of them in hushed tones, as though raising their voices might somehow summon the cold back. The winter of 1779 was that kind of winter. In the Appalachian highlands of western Virginia, where the mountains rose in ancient folded ridges above valleys that barely saw the sun from November to March, the cold that year arrived not as a season, but as a sentence. It came early. It came hard. And it did not leave. By the second week of October, weeks before the first frost was expected, the temperatures had already plunged below freezing and stayed there. The old-timers in the small settlements scattered across the mountain hollows shook their heads and looked at the sky with the particular expression of people who have learned, through hard experience, that nature does not negotiate. The creek at the bottom of Harrow's Hollow froze solid on the night of October 14th. That had never happened before. Not in October. Not in living memory. The livestock felt it first, as animals always do. Cattle pressed together in their pens with a desperation that their owners found unsettling. Pigs refused to leave their shelters. Horses stood with their heads low, and their breath rising in thick clouds that hung in the still, frozen air like smoke from a dying fire. The mountain forests, which, in a normal autumn, would have been alive with the movement of deer and elk and the chatter of squirrels racing to finish their winter stores, fell eerily quiet. The animals had gone to ground. They knew what was coming. The people of Harrow's Creek, a settlement of 31 families clinging to a narrow strip of workable land between two ridge lines in what would one day be part of present-day West Virginia, watched the signs and worked faster. They slaughtered livestock early to preserve the meat rather than risk losing the animals to the cold. They tripled their firewood stores, sending every able-bodied man and older boy into the forest with axes. They sealed the gaps in their cabin walls with mud and moss and strips of cured hide. They pulled their root vegetables from the ground and packed them in straw in their root cellars. They did everything right, and still, what was coming would test them beyond anything they had prepared for. But the story of that winter, the story that would be told and retold across the Appalachians for the next 2 centuries, did not belong to the settlement of Harrow's Creek. It belonged to a man who lived 4 miles above it, alone on the upper fork of the Cheat River, in a log cabin he had built with his own hands 8 years before. His name was Elias Croft. Elias Croft was 42 years old in the autumn of 1779, though he looked older. The mountains had a way of aging men, not cruelly, but honestly, etching every hard season into the lines of their faces, every cold night into the set of their shoulders. He was lean in the way that men who work with their bodies and eat only what they need are lean, not thin, but stripped down to function, like a tool worn smooth from use. His hands were large and scarred, his eyes a pale, steady gray that people in Harrow's Creek sometimes found difficult to hold, not because they were unkind eyes, because they were patient in a way that made other people feel slightly rushed. He had come to these mountains in 1771 at the age of 34, with his wife Margaret and nothing else but 2 horses, a chest of tools, and the particular kind of stubborn optimism that drove men westward in those years. Margaret had been 30 years old then, sharp-minded, clear-eyed, possessed of a dry humor that could cut through Elias's occasional brooding like a blade through fog. She had not been built for the frontier in the way that phrase is usually meant. She was not physically imposing, not hardened or rough-edged, but she had something more durable than physical toughness. She had a quality of attention, a way of being fully present in whatever moment she occupied that made the hardest days feel navigable. They had built the cabin together, felled the first trees together, dug the root cellar together on their hands and knees in the Rocky Mountain soil. They had no children. A grief they carried quietly, without drama, the way couples who have survived other griefs learn to carry the ones that cannot be fixed. What they had instead was each other, and the life they built from scratch on that mountain, and the particular intimacy of two people who have depended on each other completely for years. Margaret died in the summer of 1776, taken by a fever that came on fast and burned hot, and did not respond to anything Dorothea Marsh, the settlement's healer, tried to do for her. She was gone in 11 days. Elias sat with her through all of them, barely sleeping, barely eating, holding her hand, and talking to her quietly when she was lucid, and sitting in silence when she was not. When she died, he wrapped her in her best wool blanket and buried her on the eastern slope of the ridge behind the cabin, where the morning light hit first and stayed longest. He marked the grave with a flat piece of granite he had carried up from the creek on his back, and he carved her name into it with his hunting knife, letter by careful letter. Then he came back inside, sat down at the table, and did not speak to another human being for 3 weeks. The people of Harrow's Creek gave him space, the way mountain communities give space, not from indifference, but from respect. They knew that grief, like weather, had to be waited out. Some losses could not be talked through or prayed away or fixed with casseroles and company. Some losses had to be sat with until they changed shape into something a person could carry without being crushed. Elias sat with his. But something in him did not fully return after Margaret died. He had always been a quiet man, self-sufficient, private, more comfortable in the forest than in company. After her death, that quietness deepened into something more deliberate. He began making fewer trips to the settlement. He extended his trapping lines further into the mountains, staying out for days at a time. He accepted help, less. He offered it less. The cabin that had been a home became a shelter, and the man inside it became, incrementally, more of a ghost than a neighbor. By the autumn of 1779, Elias Croft had not shared a meal with another person in nearly 8 months. His preparations for winter that year were meticulous, as they always were. Elias was not a careless man. Whatever else the years had done to him, they had not made him reckless. He had survived 9 Appalachian winters alone, and he understood, with the deep practical knowledge of a man who has paid close attention to his surroundings for a long time, exactly what the mountains required of a person who intended to live through them. His firewood was cut, split, and stacked 3 weeks before the first frost, a full cord more than he estimated he would need, because Elias always built in margins. His food stores were substantial. 40 pounds of smoked venison hanging from iron hooks in the rafters, 2 barrels of dried corn he had traded furs for in August, a crate of salted fish, dried beans, hard cheese sealed in wax, and a small barrel of apple cider vinegar that he used for everything from preserving food to treating minor wounds. He had repaired the cabin roof in September, replacing 2 sections of bark shingles that had softened over the summer. He had re-chinked the walls with fresh mud and moss, checked every hinge and shutter, reinforced the door frame that had begun to warp. He had also, that autumn, been watching the signs with more attention than usual. The woolly bear caterpillars he found on the ridge in late September were almost entirely black, according to the old mountain wisdom, a sign of a severe winter ahead. He had dismissed such things as superstition before. That year, looking at those small, dark creatures moving with unusual urgency across the frozen ground, he felt something he could not quite name. Not fear. Something quieter and more specific. A premonition, perhaps. Or simply the accumulated pattern recognition of a man who had spent 20 years reading a landscape. He had planned to make one final trip to Harrow's Creek before the heavy snow came, to trade the season's remaining furs for a few items he could not produce himself. A new whetstone, lamp oil, a length of rope to replace his trapping lines, and, though he would not have said so aloud, the brief, uncomfortable comfort of human proximity. He had been carrying the furs in a pack by the door for 2 weeks, waiting for a clear day. There had been no clear days. The sky had been the color of an old iron pot since the first week of November, pressing low over the ridges, heavy with weather that had not yet decided what form to take. On the morning of November 17th, he looked out his window and judged the sky passable. Not good, but passable. He should have waited. Every person who later heard the story said the same thing, and Elias himself would say it for the rest of his life, without bitterness, but with the particular clarity of a man who has made an honest accounting of his own mistakes. He should have waited. The signs were there. The pressure in the air, the way the wind had been shifting unpredictably for 3 days, the behavior of the 2 remaining birds he could see in the birch trees outside his window, restless, low to the branches, not feeding. He knew what those signs meant. He had known for years, and he went anyway. He told himself it was practicality. He needed the supplies. The window might not come again for weeks. He told himself the storm, if it came, would give him enough warning to turn back. The truth, which he would only admit much later, in the pages of his journal, alone by firelight in a borrowed room in Harrow's Creek, was simpler and sadder than practicality. He had been alone in that cabin for 8 months. The walls had begun to feel like they were moving inward. He needed to see another human face, even briefly, even in the context of a transaction conducted in 4 or 5 sentences. He needed to exist, for just a few hours, in a world that contained other people. That need, as much as anything, was what put him on the mountain trail to Harrow's Creek on the morning of November 17th, 1779. He made good time for the first 2 hours. The trail was hard frozen and clear, and his long legs carried him steadily downhill through the silent forest. The cold was sharp, but manageable, somewhere around 15 degrees. He estimated, with a light wind from the northwest that he kept on his left cheek as a compass reference. The pack of furs on his back was heavy but balanced, and the familiar rhythm of walking on known ground settled something in him that had been unsettled for months. He was perhaps 4 miles from Harrow's Creek, just past the second ridge crossing, when the sky changed. It did not change gradually. That was what struck him afterward, the speed of it. One moment, the clouds above him were the same flat grey they had been all morning, pressing but static. The next, they were moving. Not drifting, not rolling in from the west, the way a normal storm front arrived, but churning, dropping, collapsing downward toward the ridgelines, with a speed that made him stop walking and stand still, watching, with the particular stillness of a man whose instincts have just fired all at once. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of 5 minutes. He felt it on his exposed face like a hand pressing cold cloth against his skin. The wind, which had been light and directional, suddenly lost its direction entirely, gusting from 3 different angles in quick succession before settling into a sustained, shrieking assault from the northwest that bent the bare birch trees at the trail's edge into anguished curves. And then the snow came. Not in flakes, in sheets. Horizontal walls of white that reduced visibility to nothing in the space of a breath, that drove into his face with a force that made him turn his back to it instinctively, gasping. The temperature continued to fall. He could feel it in his lungs. That particular burn of air so cold it hurts to inhale, a sensation every mountain dweller knows and fears. Elias did not hesitate. He turned immediately and started back toward the cabin. He had 4 miles to cover. He had done it in 2 hours on the way down. He was experienced, physically capable, and he knew the trail. Under normal circumstances, 4 miles was nothing. But the storm had changed the world in the space of minutes. The trail, packed earth and frozen leaves, familiar as a hallway, had disappeared under 6 inches of new snow before he had gone half a mile back. The wind was coming from the northwest, which meant it was in his face going uphill, driving the snow into his eyes with enough force to make them water instantly, the moisture freezing on his lashes and narrowing his vision to a blur. He pulled the collar of his coat up and ducked his head and pushed forward, using the tree line as his guide, the dark shapes of the trunks on either side of the trail, the only reference point he had. For the first hour, it was simply hard. Hard walking, hard breathing, hard seeing. The snow was coming faster than it could settle, swirling and piling and drifting in patterns that had nothing to do with the underlying terrain. He had walked this trail hundreds of times. He knew where it curved, where it climbed, where the roots came up through the dirt that caught a careless boot. But those landmarks were gone now, buried or invisible, and the mountain he knew was being replaced in real time by a mountain he did not recognize. The second hour was when he realized he was in serious trouble. The wind had shifted. He did not notice it immediately. He was too focused on moving, on keeping his feet under him on the slick ground, on protecting his face from the driven snow. But the trees had changed. The trail, what he could still perceive of it, had changed. He stopped, breathing hard, and tried to orient himself by the wind direction, and discovered that the wind was now coming from directly behind him instead of from his left, which meant he had turned without realizing it, which meant he was no longer moving uphill toward the cabin. He was moving across the ridge, possibly downhill. He stopped completely. In a whiteout, movement in the wrong direction was more dangerous than no movement at all. He knew this. He pressed his back against the nearest tree, a thick oak, old enough to have a trunk like a pillar, and made himself stand still and think, despite the cold that was working its way through his coat with patient, methodical efficiency. His cabin was northeast of his current position, or what he believed was his current position. The wind had been northwest on the way up. It was now directly behind him, which meant he was facing southeast. To get back to the cabin, he needed to turn completely around and move at an angle to the wind rather than directly into it. He turned. He started moving. After 20 minutes of fighting uphill through chest-deep drifts in the hollows between the ridges, he found a tree line he did not recognize. He stopped again, turned again. The wind had shifted again. The mountain was disorienting him systematically, the way mountains do in storms, not through malice, but through the simple, devastating indifference of natural systems that do not account for human navigation. The ridgelines confused the wind into unpredictable eddies and reversals. The snow erased every landmark. The cold slowed his thinking at the edges, made certainty harder to hold on to. By the time the pale, storm-filtered light began to fade, earlier than normal, the clouds swallowing what little winter sun there had been, Elias Croft accepted, with the grim clarity that was his most reliable characteristic, that he was lost. Not slightly off course. Lost. 4 miles from his cabin, 4 miles from the settlement, with darkness coming, a temperature already somewhere below zero, and a storm that showed no sign of breaking. He had perhaps 2 hours of useful movement left before the cold and darkness made walking more dangerous than stopping. He needed shelter. Now. He turned his face into the wind and moved horizontally along the ridge, searching the granite outcroppings with his hands as much as his eyes, feeling through the snow for the solid cold of stone. His hands were already losing sensation. He had not worn his heaviest gloves, judging the morning's cold manageable, and that judgment was now costing him. He tucked his right hand inside his coat against his body, using only his left to feel along the rock faces, and kept moving with the focused urgency of a man who understands exactly how small his margin has become. He found the outcropping 30 minutes before full dark. It was not much. A granite shelf angled outward from the ridge face, with perhaps 3 feet of clearance underneath and a width of about 6 feet. Barely enough to call a cave. But it blocked the wind from the northwest completely, and that single fact in those conditions was the difference between life and death. Elias Croft crawled underneath the granite shelf, pulled the pack of furs in after him, and began, with fingers he could barely feel, to build the only barrier he had against the most violent night the Appalachian Mountains had produced in living memory. He did not know in that moment that the storm would not break for 11 more days. He did not know that search parties would eventually be sent from Harrow's Creek, or that a 17-year-old boy named Thomas Reed would find him emerging from the forest like something the mountain had chewed on and decided to spit back out. He did not know any of what was coming. He knew only the cold, the stone, the wind screaming outside his makeshift shelter, and the slow, stubborn refusal to stop. A refusal that had no name yet, that he would only understand much later as the first evidence that something in him still intended to survive. He pulled the furs tight around his body. He tucked his damaged hands against his chest. He closed his eyes. He waited for dawn. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the deep wilderness during a heavy snowstorm. A silence that is not truly silent at all, but rather a layering of sounds so constant and so overwhelming that the human brain eventually stops processing them as distinct and registers them instead as a kind of white noise. A roaring stillness that presses against the ears and the mind with equal force. The wind, the creak of frozen trees, the hiss of snow driving against bark and stone, the occasional crack, like a rifle shot, of sap freezing and splitting inside a trunk somewhere in the darkness. Elias Croft lay under his granite shelf and listened to all of it through the long first night, and did not sleep. Not because he was not exhausted. He was exhausted in the boneless, total way that extreme cold produces, a fatigue that went beyond muscles and into something cellular, something that felt like the body beginning to negotiate with itself about what was essential and what could be released. He did not sleep because he knew, with the hard-won knowledge of a man who had spent decades reading his own body's signals, that sleep in these conditions was a gamble he could not afford to lose. The temperature outside his shelter was dropping steadily. He could tell by the way the air tasted, a specific metallic sharpness that he associated with temperatures well below zero. And by the way the snow, which had been wet and heavy when the storm first hit, was now dry and crystalline, squeaking against itself with the high-pitched compression that only happened in serious cold. He had managed, in the last 30 minutes before dark, to construct a windbreak at the open face of his shelter. It was crude. Branches broken from the birch trees nearest the outcropping, wedged vertically into the packed snow at the shelf's edge and interlaced with smaller twigs. The whole structure backed by a wall of snow he had packed with his forearms and chest rather than his hands, which by then were too numb for fine work. It blocked perhaps 70% of the wind. It was not enough to make the space warm. It was enough to make it survivable. He had arranged the furs from his pack as efficiently as he could, one beneath him, as insulation against the frozen ground, which stole body heat faster than the air did, and two wrapped around his body in overlapping layers, with particular attention to his core. He had learned years ago, from a Cherokee trader who passed through the settlements twice a year and who possessed a practical knowledge of wilderness survival that made the mountain men look like amateurs, that the body's priority in extreme cold was always the core, the chest, the abdomen, the organs that kept everything else running. Hands and feet could be sacrificed temporarily if the core stayed warm. Let the core go cold and nothing else mattered. He kept his hands pressed flat against his abdomen, inside his coat and inside the furs, and focused on breathing slowly and regularly, conserving every calorie of heat his body generated. He thought about Margaret, not deliberately. He rarely allowed himself to think about her deliberately anymore, having learned that deliberate remembering had a weight to it that he could not always carry. But in extremis, in the stripped-down state that serious danger produced, the defenses he had constructed around her memory became thin and unreliable, and she came through them without asking permission. He thought about the way she had looked on winter mornings in their first years on the mountain, sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a tin mug of hot water and dried herbs, the closest thing they had to tea, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, reading by the firelight, with the focused expression she brought to everything she did. He thought about the sound of her voice reading aloud to him in the evenings. She had been better educated than he was, had grown up in a household with books, and she read to him regularly from the small collection she had carried west, her voice moving through the sentences with a rhythm that he had found, over the years, as necessary as food. He thought about her hands, which were small and quick and capable, and which he had held at the end while they grew still. He made himself stop. Not because the memories hurt. They did, but the hurt was familiar and contained. He stopped because he needed his mind working on the present, not the past. He needed to inventory, plan, calculate. He went through what he had. The furs, 3 good beaver pelts and 2 deer hides, were serving as bedding and insulation. They could not be traded now, but that was irrelevant. His flint and steel were in the inner pocket of his coat, where he always kept them, a habit so ingrained it was reflex. His hunting knife was on his belt. His iron pot was in the pack, small, heavy, capable of holding perhaps a quart of liquid. His coil of rope, 30 feet of good hemp cord, was also in the pack. He had a small leather pouch of dried venison. He had grabbed it from the kitchen shelf on his way out that morning, a habit of always carrying something to eat on any journey, however short. He estimated there was perhaps half a pound of meat in the pouch, half a pound of dried venison, in conditions that were burning calories at 3 or 4 times his normal resting rate just to maintain body temperature. He rationed it immediately, in his head, without sentiment. 3 strips per day. At that rate, he had perhaps 5 days of food. After that, he would need to find other sources, which meant the snares he would set as soon as there was enough light and enough break in the weather to work outside. Water was less immediately critical, but still essential. Snow was everywhere, but eating snow directly dropped core temperature and cost the body more energy to melt it than the water provided. He needed to melt it first. He could use the iron pot and body heat. Slow, inefficient, but possible. Or he could find a way to build a fire. Fire. He turned the problem over carefully. The windbreak he had constructed was not sufficient to shelter a fire. The wind, even reduced by 70%, was still enough to defeat a small flame. But if the storm broke or even moderated, a fire outside the shelter entrance would change everything. Warmth, water, the possibility of cooking whatever he could catch. He committed to attempting it at the first opportunity. For now, he pressed his iron pot against his abdomen, packed it with snow through the gap in his windbreak, and held it there, adding the heat of his body to the task of melting it. It took 2 hours to produce a quarter cup of water. He drank it and packed the pot again. Outside, the storm did not break. If anything, it intensified. The second day was harder than the first, in ways that had nothing to do with the cold. The cold was a known quantity by then. Brutal, constant, demanding of respect and management, but known. What the second day brought was the weight of time. Elias was not a man given to impatience. His life had trained him in the art of waiting, for weather to clear, for animals to come to his snares, for seasons to turn. But there is a difference between chosen waiting and imposed waiting, between the patience of a hunter and the stillness of a prisoner. By the middle of the second day, with the storm showing no sign of moderating and the grey light through his windbreak unchanging from morning to afternoon, he felt the walls of his situation pressing in with a psychological force that was almost physical. He combated it the way he combated most things, with work. He spent the morning improving his shelter. Using his knife to cut additional branches, he reinforced the windbreak until it blocked nearly all the wind, leaving only a small gap at the top for air circulation. He dug out the floor of the shelter, which had accumulated several inches of wind-driven snow overnight, and repacked it with fresh snow that he then compressed into a hard surface less likely to shift. He rearranged the furs more efficiently and used the rope to lash several branches into a crude framework above his sleeping space, creating a small additional layer of insulation between his body and the granite shelf above him. The work kept his hands moving, which kept them from losing sensation entirely. It kept his mind occupied. And it produced, when he looked at the improved shelter at midday, a small but genuine satisfaction. The particular pride of a practical man who has made something better with limited materials. In the afternoon he set snares. Setting snares in a blizzard is an exercise in stubborn optimism. Most animals in their right minds were deep in their dens and burrows, insulated from the cold and not moving. Elias knew this. But he also knew that storms eventually passed, that animals eventually needed to eat, and that a snare set and baited before the weather broke was a snare that might yield something the morning after it broke. He set 4 of them, using the last of his hemp rope cut into lengths, positioned along the most sheltered side of the outcropping where small animals might naturally seek cover. A rabbit run he could see in the pattern of the snow. A narrow gap between 2 boulders that smelled faintly of something living. He baited them with the smallest possible amounts of his dried venison, crumbs, essentially, scattered in a line leading to the trigger loop. It felt profligate to use his food as bait. He did it anyway. The mathematics were clear. A rabbit, even a small one, represented far more calories than the few strips of venison he spent to catch it. That night, the temperature dropped further. He knew because the moisture in his exhaled breath was freezing on the inside of his windbreak, forming a thin layer of frost on the branches that caught what little light filtered through. He had heard stories from older trappers about temperatures so low that spit froze before it hit the ground. He was approaching that territory. He pulled the furs tighter and thought about fire with the focused intensity of a man contemplating salvation. On the 3rd day, the storm moderated slightly. Not enough to travel, not enough to see more than 20 feet, but enough that the wind dropped from a sustained roar to an intermittent howl, giving him windows of relative stillness that lasted 2 or 3 minutes at a time. During one of those windows, he pushed through his windbreak and built a fire. It took 40 minutes and 3 attempts. The wood was wet with snow, and his hands were stiff enough that the fine motor work of striking flint and steel and positioning tinder required a concentration that left him breathing hard with effort. But on the 3rd attempt, the spark caught a small piece of dry bark he had kept inside his coat against his body, and the flame took hold, and he fed it with the smallest twigs he had, and then slightly larger ones, sheltering it from the wind with his own body, talking to it under his breath, the way a man talks to something fragile that he very much needs to survive. The fire lived. It was small, barely larger than his 2 cupped hands, but it was real. And the heat it produced against his face in that moment was something he would remember for the rest of his life as one of the most purely physical experiences of relief he had ever felt. He melted snow in the iron pot and drank half a quart of water in one sitting. He held his hands close enough to the flames to feel them begin to ache with returning circulation, which hurt considerably, but meant the tissue was still alive. He cut 2 strips of venison and held them over the flame until they softened slightly, and ate them slowly, chewing each piece longer than necessary, drawing out the act of eating because the warmth and the food together created something close to comfort, and comfort was a currency he could not afford to spend carelessly. He checked his snares. 3 were empty and undisturbed. The 4th had been triggered, but whatever had triggered it was gone, too small or too clever, or he had not secured the loop properly with his stiff fingers. He reset it and went back inside. That night he slept for the first time. 4 broken hours. Waking each time the cold worked its way through his insulation to a level his body could not ignore, feeding the fire he had managed to keep burning at the shelter's entrance, then sleeping again. It was not restful sleep, but it was sleep. And in the economy of survival, sleep was as important as food. The 4th and 5th days blurred together in his journal entries, which became shorter as his energy decreased. The storm remained. His food supply dropped to its final portions. His right hand, which had taken the worst of the early exposure when he had used it bare to reset the snare on the 2nd day, was increasingly painful. A deep, throbbing ache in the 2 middle fingers that he recognized as bad news. Frostbite that ached was frostbite that still had living tissue in it, which was better than frostbite that had gone numb entirely. But the discoloration he could see in the firelight, a dark, purplish grey at the fingertips, told him that the damage was serious and would not resolve on its own. He kept the hand pressed against his body as much as possible. He did not look at the fingers more than necessary. There was nothing to be done about them here, and looking at them did nothing except feed a particular kind of dread that he could not afford. On the 5th day, his food ran out. He wrote in his journal that evening, by the light of his small fire. Last of the venison this morning, snares empty again, water adequate, fire holding. Right hand concerning. Have not seen sun in 5 days, Storm continues. I am not ready to die here. That last sentence surprised him when he wrote it. He had not planned to write it. It appeared on the page as though his hand had decided something his conscious mind was still working out, a declaration made before he had finished making it, a line drawn in the frozen ground. He was not ready to die here. He read the sentence twice, and then he closed the journal, and he sat by his fire, and he thought about what that meant, what it required of him, specifically, practically, in the next 12 hours. Then he went to work. On the 6th day, he caught a rabbit. It came to the snare in the early morning, in the grey pre-dawn light when the storm had dropped momentarily to almost nothing, just a light snowfall and a cold that had, if anything, deepened further. He heard the snare trigger, a faint, specific sound he had been listening for across 5 days of wind and silence. And he was out of the shelter and moving before he had fully processed what he had heard. The rabbit was small, desperately small, a juvenile, probably born late in the season, its ribs visible through its thin winter coat. It was alive when he reached it, looking up at him with the black, liquid eyes that rabbits have, which show neither fear nor accusation, but simply an absolute, uncontestable presence in the moment. He killed it quickly. He had done it hundreds of times, and he knew how to do it without prolonging anything. He carried it back to the shelter, and he skinned it by the fire with hands that were not as steady as he would have liked, and he put every part of it into the iron pot with snow and set it over the flames. While it cooked, he sat very still and felt something move through him that was not quite emotion and not quite thought, but something between the two, a recognition of where he was exactly and what he was doing, and how thin the margin was between the man by the fire and the frozen body that no one would find until spring. He had trapped and killed thousands of animals in his life. He had never felt the weight of it the way he felt it now. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of solemn awareness of exchange. The small animal's life for the continuation of his own. The mountain's terms, accepted without negotiation. He ate everything. The meat, the organs, the marrow cracked from the tiny bones. He drank the broth, and then packed the pot with snow again, and drank the meltwater and lay back on his furs, and felt, for the first time in 6 days, something other than the immediate pressure of survival. He felt grateful. It was an unfamiliar sensation. Elias Croft was not, by habit or temperament, a man who spent much time in gratitude. He had been raised in the pragmatic, unsentimental tradition of frontier Protestantism, where survival was expected, and suffering was simply the condition of human existence, not something requiring particular acknowledgement. Gratitude had always seemed to him slightly soft, an emotion for people with enough comfort to afford reflection. Lying in his granite shelter on the 6th day of the worst storm in Appalachian memory, with 2 blackening fingers and empty snares and a storm that still had not broken, he understood for the first time what gratitude actually was. Not softness, not sentiment. It was the recognition, precise and clear, of what you had not yet lost. He had not yet lost his life. He closed his eyes. Outside, the wind began again. The storm broke on the 11th day. Not gradually, not with the slow moderation that most storms produce as they exhaust themselves, but suddenly, decisively, as though some authority had simply withdrawn permission for it to continue. Elias woke on the morning of November 28th to a silence so complete that it pulled him out of sleep like a hand on his shoulder. He lay still for a moment, listening, certain it was a lull, another brief pause before the wind returned. But the silence held, and after 3 full minutes of unbroken quiet, he pushed through his windbreak and stood upright in the open air for the first time in 11 days. The world was almost incomprehensible. Snow lay everywhere in depths that had no precedent in his experience. 8, 10, 12 feet in the hollows between ridges, packed into sculpted shapes by 11 days of wind that had rearranged the entire landscape into something alien. Trees he knew had vanished beneath the accumulation. The trail he had been walking when the storm hit, a path he had used hundreds of times, worn into the mountain's skin by years of passage, was simply gone, buried under a featureless white expanse that gave no indication of what lay beneath it or where anything was in relation to anything else. The sky above was a blue so pure and so absolute that it seemed artificial, the particular shade of winter sky that only appears after a major storm has cleared the atmosphere of every particle of moisture, leaving behind a clarity that was almost painful after 11 days of grey. The sun was up, barely above the ridgeline to the southeast, and it struck the snow with a light that was not warm, but was ferociously bright, bouncing off the white surface with an intensity that made his eyes water immediately. He stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then he went back inside, ate the last strips of meat from a second rabbit he had caught on the 9th day, drank the last of his melted water, and began to prepare to move. He conducted himself with the methodical efficiency of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment and has spent the waiting time preparing for it. He dismantled his windbreak and added the best of the dry branches to a small fire he had kept burning through the night, melting enough snow to fill his stomach with water. He wrapped his right hand, the 2 damaged fingers now clearly in trouble, dark and stiff and producing a constant deep ache. In strips he cut from the interior lining of his coat, padding the injured tissue and protecting it from direct exposure. He redistributed the furs in his pack, keeping 2 on his body as a layered outer garment that made him look, from any distance, like something that had grown rather than been made. He checked his knife, his flint and steel, his pot. He looked once at the journal. He did not write in it. There would be time for writing later, or there would not be. He put it in the inner pocket of his coat, against his chest, where it would stay dry. Then he stepped out into the snow and began to move south. The first obstacle appeared within a quarter mile. The creek, which in a normal year crossed the trail at a ford that was at most knee-deep and 20 feet wide, had become something else entirely. The 11 days of snow had loaded every drainage above it to a breaking point, and at some point during the storm, a section of ice had given way, and the water had surged over its banks and then refrozen in a spreading, irregular sheet that now covered perhaps an acre of the valley floor to an unknown depth, with fresh snow on top that concealed where the solid ground ended and the ice-covered water began. He found this out by stepping on what he believed was a snowfield and breaking through. The water hit him from the knees down with a cold so complete and so absolute that his body's response was purely involuntary. A full-body convulsion, a gasp that nearly dropped him, a surge of adrenaline that was the only thing that kept him moving instead of freezing in place. He had been in cold water before. He had never been in water this cold. It was, he would write later, like stepping into something that was no longer a liquid, but had not yet decided to be a solid. Something in between states that existed only to transfer cold directly into living tissue as efficiently as possible. He got out. He did not panic. Panic in this situation was a death sentence more certain than the water itself, and some part of Elias Croft's character, the part that had been forged over 42 years of difficult living, simply refused to panic as a matter of principle. He pulled himself out of the water by plunging his arms into the snow and using them as levers, dragging his lower body onto what he hoped was solid ground, testing each new point of contact before committing his weight. When he was out, he was shaking with a violence that made it difficult to stand. His lower legs and feet were soaked through, and in temperatures that were somewhere around 10 degrees above zero, soaked clothing was a clock that had already started running. He had, he estimated, perhaps 45 minutes before the wet clothing began pulling enough heat from his body to impair his function. After that, an indeterminate and shortening window before the situation became irreversible. He stripped off his outer leg coverings, the heavy wool leggings he wore over his breeches, and wrung them with the mechanical, forceful movements of a man who is using his body as a tool and is not interested in how it feels about the job. He could not get them dry. He could get them less wet. He put them back on. The cold, damp fabric against his skin was a new category of unpleasant. And he started moving. Not walking. Moving. A pace somewhere between a fast walk and a controlled run, pumping his arms, driving his legs through the snow with everything he had, generating heat through sheer mechanical effort. He had done the same calculation 100 times on winter hunting trips when he had gotten wet crossing a stream. Movement was the only heater he had. If he moved fast enough and hard enough, his body would produce more heat than the wet clothing could steal. He ran. For the better part of a mile, through snow that was in places above his knees, up a slope that gained 300 feet of elevation in that distance, he drove himself forward, with the single-minded urgency of a man running from something he cannot see, but knows is directly behind him. His lungs burned. His legs were slabs of meat with diminishing sensation. His vision narrowed to the next 10 feet of snow in front of him. The next step, and the next, and the next. He reached the crest of the slope and stopped, braced against a pine tree with both hands, breathing in ragged pulls. He looked down at his legs. He could feel them, which was the important thing. Cold and aching and working. He flexed his feet inside his boots. His toes responded sluggishly, but they responded. He had bought himself time. How much time, he could not say. He kept moving. The second day of the walk brought him something unexpected, evidence that he was not alone on the mountain. He had been following the ridgeline southwest, a longer route than the direct trail, but one that kept him on high ground and away from the flooded creek bottoms, when he saw the smoke. It was barely visible against the bright winter sky, a thin thread rising from somewhere in the valley below, pale gray against the blue. He stopped and looked at it for a long time, making sure it was real and not a trick of his tired, cold, stressed eyes. It was real. He considered his options. The smoke could be a settlement he didn't know, unlikely but possible. It could be a hunter's camp. It could be a farmstead set back from the main trail that had survived the storm intact. Whatever it was, it meant people. And people meant warmth and food, and the possibility of a surgeon's attention for his hand, which had progressed from concerning to genuinely alarming over the past 24 hours. He changed course and descended toward the smoke. What he found was not a settlement or a farmstead. It was a dead elk, a large bull, probably 600 pounds in life, that had died against a fallen tree during the storm and was now frozen solid in a posture of collapsed exhaustion. The smoke was not smoke at all. It was steam. The elk's body, insulated by the deep snow around it, had retained enough heat to remain slightly above freezing at its core, and where the snow had compressed against the carcass and then sublimated in the morning sun, it produced a vapor that rose in a thin column visible from the ridge. Elias stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then he took out his knife. The elk was frozen, but not frozen through. The outer layer of muscle was like cutting wood, but 2 inches in, the meat was still workable. He cut methodically, taking the best of it. The tenderloin, sections of hindquarter, the liver, which he ate raw, and immediately, crouching in the snow beside the carcass with the unself-conscious efficiency of a man who is well past caring about appearances. The liver was cold and dense, and tasted like iron and life, and he ate all of it, and felt it begin working in him before he had finished. He built a fire in the shelter of the fallen tree, the same position that had given the elk enough protection to retain its warmth, and cooked the muscle meat partially, eating half and packing the rest in the furs in his pack, where the cold would keep it. He melted snow and drank until he felt waterlogged. He dried his leggings and boots by the fire, turning them methodically, getting them not warm but dry, which was all he needed. He rested for 2 hours. In the calculus of survival, rest was now as important as movement. His body had been operating under extreme stress for nearly 2 weeks, burning reserves that were not infinite. He ate again before he left, drinking the broth from the meat he had cooked, and then he stood, adjusted the pack on his back, and turned south again. He was moving better than he had been. The food made the difference, not just the calories, but the psychological fact of having eaten, of the body registering that it had been provisioned and could continue. He covered 3 miles that afternoon through snow that was gradually becoming more navigable as he dropped in elevation and the landscape opened into the broader valleys where the drifts were less severe. On the 3rd day, he saw tracks. Human tracks. 2 sets, possibly 3, moving roughly east through the snow, perhaps a day ahead of him, based on how the edges had settled and refrozen. He stood over them for a long moment, reading them the way he read animal signs, direction, pace, weight distribution, how the boots had broken the surface crust. 2 men, moving at a steady pace, not running, not panicked, searching. The word arrived in his mind fully formed without drama. Searching. Someone had come out looking. Whether they were looking for him specifically, he could not know. But they were men from the settlement. He could tell by the boot prints, which matched the style of footwear the men of Harrow's Creek favored. A broad-soled moccasin with a leather upper that left a distinctive pattern in soft snow. They had been here yesterday. He followed the tracks. He heard the voice before he saw the person. He had been moving through a stretch of young birch trees, bare white trunks in the snow, the forest thin enough here that the light came through cleanly. When he heard it, a human voice calling a name. His name. Elias. Elias Croft. The voice was young, slightly hoarse from calling, carrying across the frozen air with the particular clarity that extreme cold gives to sound. He stopped walking. In the 11 days in the cave and the 3 days of walking, he had heard no human voice. He had heard wind and the crack of frozen trees, and the sound of his own breathing, and once the distant call of a crow somewhere above the storm. He had heard, in the small hours of the worst nights, the sound of his own voice talking quietly to the darkness, reciting things, mostly. The names of the constellations Margaret had taught him, the steps of the trapping process, multiplication tables from a schoolroom he had attended 40 years ago, keeping the mind working, keeping the self present. He had not heard another human voice. The effect of hearing one now, hearing his own name in a living throat, across the white silence of the mountain forest, was not what he would have predicted. He had expected relief. He felt instead something that took him a moment to identify, an overwhelming and completely unexpected desire to sit down in the snow and stay there. He did not sit down. He called back. His voice came out wrong, rougher and smaller than he intended, abraded by 2 weeks of cold and disuse. He cleared his throat and called again, louder, pushing the sound out with deliberate effort. "Here, I'm here." The answering shout came almost immediately, from perhaps 100 yards to his left, accompanied by the crashing sound of someone moving fast through deep snow without caring about the noise. And then a figure appeared between the birch trees, young, tall, moving with the uncoordinated urgency of someone who has just received news that has temporarily overridden their motor control. And Elias Croft recognized him as Thomas Reed, the 17-year-old son of William Reed, who farmed the lower meadow outside Harrow's Creek. Thomas stopped when he saw him. He stood very still, perhaps 20 feet away, looking at him with an expression that Elias could not immediately interpret. Somewhere between shock and recognition, as though the person in front of him matched a description, but not an expectation. Later, Thomas Reed would describe the moment to anyone who asked. He came out of the trees like a shadow. I didn't recognize him at first. He was covered in furs from head to foot, and his beard had grown out wild, and there was ice in it. I thought he was a bear walking upright. Then he spoke my name, and I nearly fell over. Elias had not spoken Thomas's name. He had said, with the characteristic economy of a man for whom words were tools rather than ornamentation. "Thomas, I could use some help." Thomas Reed covered the 20 feet between them in 4 strides and grabbed his arm to steady him. And in that grip, in that simple, physical human contact, the first he had felt in 11 days, in a cave, and 3 days on a mountain, something in Elias Croft that had been held very tightly for a very long time released its grip, fractionally, on itself. He did not show it. He stood straight and breathed evenly and said, in response to Thomas's rapid, overlapping questions, "Are you hurt? How long have you been out here? There are 3 of us looking. My father is on the North Ridge." That he was functional, that he had been out 12 days, and that his right hand required attention. What he did not say, and would not say for months, was that hearing his name called across the white silence of those mountains had done something to him that no amount of cold had managed. It had reminded him, in a way that bypassed argument and reasoning entirely, that somewhere below the ridgeline, in the settlement he had been incrementally withdrawing from for 3 years, people had noticed his absence. People had come out into the worst winter in living memory to find him. He was not as alone as he had decided to be. He filed the information away carefully, the way he filed everything, without drama, without immediate conclusion. There would be time to think about what it meant. First, there was the matter of getting off the mountain. Thomas Reed put 2 fingers in his mouth and produced a whistle that split the cold air like a blade, the signal to the other searchers that the man they were looking for had been found. Somewhere to the north, faint and delayed by distance, an answering whistle came back. Elias adjusted the pack on his back and turned south. "Let's go," he said. They brought him into Harrow's Creek on a makeshift stretcher. It had been Thomas Reed's idea, and Elias had resisted it for the first half-mile of the walk down from the ridge, walking under his own power, jaw set, pack still on his back, moving with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who intends to demonstrate that he does not require carrying. Thomas had said nothing. He had simply walked alongside him, matching his pace, watching him with the quiet attention of someone who is waiting for an argument to resolve itself on its own terms. The argument resolved itself when Elias's left leg buckled on a downhill section of trail, and Thomas caught him by the arm before he went down completely. There was a pause. Elias stood with his weight on Thomas's arm and looked at the trail ahead, still 2 miles of broken terrain between them and the settlement. And then he looked at his right hand, wrapped in the strips of coat lining, dark and swollen at the fingertips. Then he looked at Thomas Reed, who was 17 years old and had been out in this cold for 3 days looking for him, and was not making a single expression that could be interpreted as triumphant. "All right," Elias said. They fashioned the stretcher from 2 pine saplings and the wool blanket that Thomas's companion, a man named Robert Haas, had carried in his pack. Elias lay on it with his pack under his head and his damaged hand resting on his chest, and the 3 men carried him the remaining 2 miles to Harrow's Creek with the careful, deliberate movements of people transporting something they intend to deliver intact. He was conscious for all of it. He watched the sky above him. That same impossible blue, the sun now dropping toward the western ridgeline in the way it did in late November, burning orange and thin above the mountains. He watched the tops of the trees moving past. He felt the sway of the stretcher and the rhythm of the men's footsteps, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was itself unusual enough to notice. For 11 days his mind had been in constant operational mode, calculating, rationing, planning, solving. Now, for the first time, it was simply present. Moving through a winter landscape on a stretcher, watching the sky, breathing air that still tasted of ice, but was no longer an adversary. When the first cabins of Harrow's Creek came into view through the trees, the smoke from their chimneys rising in straight windless columns into the cold air, the lamplight yellow in the small windows, he felt something tighten in his chest that he recognized after a moment's consideration as the physical sensation of relief. He had not expected to feel it so strongly. He had not expected it at all. Dorothea Marsh was waiting. Someone had run ahead when Thomas's whistle was answered, and by the time the stretcher reached the Reed family's cabin at the edge of the settlement, word had moved through Harrow's Creek with the speed that news always moves in small, isolated communities, instantly and completely, carrying with it the particular emotional charge of something that had been feared and had not come to pass. Elias Croft was alive. He was coming in. He was hurt, but breathing. Dorothea was 44 years old, the widow of a farmer who had died of a chest ailment 6 years prior, and she had been practicing medicine. If that word could be applied to what she did, which she herself was ambivalent about, since she was a young woman helping her father, a trained physician in Philadelphia, on his rounds. She had come west with her husband and had stayed after his death because the mountain had become, in the way that places sometimes become for people, the only geography that made sense to her anymore. She was the closest thing Harrow's Creek had to a doctor, a position she occupied without ceremony or self-importance, simply doing what needed doing with what she had. She assessed Elias with the efficient, unsentimental attention of someone who has seen a great deal of damage and learned to categorize it quickly. She started with his hands, the right one first, unwrapping the makeshift bandaging Thomas had helped her remove, examining the fingers in the lamplight with a focus that excluded everything else in the room. The 2 middle fingers of the right hand were in serious trouble. The color, a dark, purplish-black at the tips fading to a mottled grey-purple toward the second knuckle, told her that the tissue damage was deep and extensive. She pressed carefully along the length of each finger, watching his face for reaction. He gave her almost nothing, but she had enough experience to read the difference between stoicism and absence of sensation, and what she was reading was stoicism. The pain was present, which meant the tissue was still in some degree alive, which was the best news available. She moved to his feet. 3 toes on the left foot showed similar damage. Though less severe than the fingers, the boots had provided more insulation than the gloves, and he had kept moving, which had helped. 2 toes were salvageable with careful management. One, the small toe, already blackened to the second joint, was not. His overall condition she assessed methodically. Severe weight loss. She estimated 30 pounds or more from a frame that had not carried much extra to begin with. Dehydration. Moderate, now being addressed by the broth Thomas's mother had put in front of him the moment he was horizontal on the table. Core temperature, based on his coherence and response. He was answering her questions with his usual economy, complete sentences, correct information, had stabilized. No signs of the confused, slurred presentation that indicated dangerous hypothermia. Whatever he had done in that cave had kept the core warm enough. She told him what she found. She was direct about it, the way she was direct about everything, because she had long ago concluded that softening medical information was a form of disrespect. It assumed the person receiving it could not handle the truth, which was almost never accurate and frequently insulting. 2 fingers on the right hand will need to come off, she said. Below the second knuckle on both. The tissue is dead and it will not recover, and if it stays, it will go bad and the bad will spread. 1 toe on the left foot, same situation. Elias looked at his hand for a moment, then he looked at her. When? He said. Tomorrow morning. You need to sleep and eat and warm up first. Your body needs to be stronger for it. All right, he said. The same 2 words he had said to Thomas on the trail. The verbal equivalent of a door closing on one consideration and opening on the next. Dorothea gave him 2 things before she left him to sleep. A bowl of venison stew, thick with root vegetables, that Thomas's mother had been keeping warm on the fire, and a small measure of apple brandy that William Reed produced from a crock in his cellar. She watched him eat and drink with the attention of someone monitoring a patient, but also with something else, a quality of observation that had nothing clinical about it, a noticing of the particular way this man occupied space, even horizontal and damaged and exhausted, with a self-containment so complete it was almost architectural. She had known Elias Croft by sight and by reputation for 7 years. She had treated Margaret in her final illness, and had sat with Elias in the room afterward, in the specific silence that follows a death, when there is nothing useful left to do, and the only honest thing is presence. In all those years, she had exchanged perhaps 60 words with him directly. He was not a man who invited conversation. He was not a man who seemed to require anything from anyone. Watching him now, the careful way he managed the spoon with his left hand, the way he kept the right one still against his chest, the way he looked at the food with the focused gratitude of someone who has been without. She revised something she had assumed about him for years. She had assumed that his self-sufficiency was a fact about him. She was beginning to think it might be a decision, and there was a significant difference between those 2 things. She left him to sleep and went home through the cold, and she thought about that difference for a long time before she slept herself. The surgery was performed the following morning. Elias had slept 10 hours, not peacefully, Thomas reported, who had kept the fire through the night and changed the dressings as Dorothea had instructed. He had woken several times, once calling out a name that Thomas could not make out, once sitting upright and looking around the room with an expression of complete disorientation before registering where he was and lying back down. But he had slept, and when he woke, his eyes were clearer, and his color was better, and he ate the breakfast Thomas's mother put in front of him with a methodical thoroughness that she found encouraging. Dorothea arrived at first light, with her instruments wrapped in a clean cloth, a bone saw, 2 scalpels, a pair of surgical forceps, a curved needle, and waxed thread for the closure. She had boiled everything in water the night before, a practice her father had insisted on, the reasoning for which she did not entirely understand, but had observed over years of practice, genuinely reduced the incidence of wound infection. She had also brought clean linen for dressings, a bottle of spirits for sterilization, and the remainder of William Reed's apple brandy for anesthesia, such as it was. She explained the procedure to Elias in plain terms. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he asked one question. How long to heal? The wounds, 6 to 8 weeks. The function, what function there will be, longer. You'll adapt. He nodded once. I'll need something to bite down on, he said. She gave him a folded piece of leather. She positioned his hand on the table with practiced efficiency, cleaned the surgical site with the spirits. He did not react to the cold of it, which told her the brandy was doing some work, and picked up the saw. She had performed amputations before, though never under ideal conditions and never under conditions as poor as these. She was fast, because speed was mercy, and she was precise, because precision prevented complications, and she did not allow herself to think about anything except the work in front of her. The angle, the pressure, the point of separation that would take dead tissue and leave living tissue behind. Elias made no sound during the first finger. His hand was absolutely still, held in position by Robert Haas, who had been recruited for the purpose and who was doing a creditable job of looking at the wall rather than the table. During the second finger, a sound came from somewhere deep in Elias's chest. Not a cry, not a gasp, but something lower and more compressed. The sound of pain being contained rather than expressed, forced inward by pure will. His free hand found the edge of the table and gripped it. The marks it left in the wood, 4 parallel grooves pressed into the surface, were still visible years later. When it was done, she cleaned the wounds, sutured the flaps of skin over the stumps with the small, even stitches her father had taught her, and wrapped the hand in clean linen. The toe she took next, quickly, the worst already behind them both. Then she dressed everything, gave him the last of the brandy, and told him to sleep. He was unconscious within 20 minutes. He slept for 18 hours. The settlement organized itself around his recovery in the way that Harrow's Creek organized itself around most things, without formal discussion or appointed leadership, but with the collective efficiency of a community that had learned, through shared necessity, to identify what needed doing and do it. Food appeared at the Reed cabin door daily, not in the self-conscious, performative way of people trying to demonstrate their generosity, but in the practical, matter-of-fact way of people who understood that a man recovering from surgery and 2 weeks of starvation needed calories, and that calories needed to come from somewhere. Ruth Haas brought a smoked ham. The Calloway family contributed a sack of dried corn and 2 jars of preserved apple. An older woman named Agnes Boone, who had not spoken to Elias in 3 years following a property line disagreement, appeared at the door with a pot of bean soup and left without a word, which William Reed privately considered the most remarkable event of the entire winter. Firewood accumulated outside the door in a stack that grew larger every morning. Thomas Reed tended the fire through the first nights, sitting by it with the quiet constancy of someone who has decided that this is his post and does not require rotation. He fed the fire and changed the dressings and answered Elias's occasional questions about the storm, about the settlement, about what had happened to the livestock, about how many days he had been out, with the careful accuracy of someone who understood that the questions were not small talk, but orientation. A man rebuilding his map of the world from the inside out. Dorothea came twice daily. She changed the dressings, assessed the healing, managed the early signs of infection in the toe wound with a poultice of pine resin and plantain that her father had sworn by and that she had used enough times to trust. She talked to Elias while she worked, not about his wounds, not about what he had been through, but about ordinary things. the state of the settlement's food stores as winter set in, the quality of the maple grove on the south-facing slope and what it might yield in spring, the ongoing dispute between the Calloway family and the Haas family about grazing rights on the upper meadow, which had been running in various forms for 6 years and showed no signs of resolution. She did this deliberately. She had observed, in soldiers and in accident survivors, and in people who had come through the kind of extreme experience that strips a person down to their most basic components, that ordinary conversation was medicine of a specific kind, not the medicine that healed wounds, but the medicine that reminded a person that a world existed beyond the event they had survived. That ordinary life was still occurring, outside and around them, with all its mundane disputes and seasonal rhythms and small, specific textures. That there was a place in it for them, if they chose to return. Elias listened to her. He said little, but she noticed, and it was the noticing of someone who pays close attention to small signals, that the quality of his listening changed over those first days. In the beginning, it was the listening of a man being patient. By the end of the first week, it was the listening of a man who was interested. The physical recovery progressed as Dorothea had predicted. The wounds closed cleanly. The infection in the toe resolved. His weight began to return slowly, as his appetite came back. Cautiously at first, as bodies emerging from starvation are cautious, and then with an increasing commitment that Thomas Reed's mother found satisfying to supply. The stiffness in his remaining fingers gradually decreased, though it never fully resolved. Scar tissue had formed around the joints, and the hand would always work less well than it had, a fact that Elias absorbed and adapted to with the same practical determination he brought to every other constraint the world placed on him. What did not resolve as cleanly was harder to see and harder to name. On the 9th day of his recovery, lying awake in the early hours of the morning while Thomas slept in the chair by the fire, Elias took his journal from the inner pocket of his coat, which hung on a peg beside the bed, the journal having remained in the pocket through everything, and opened it to the last entry he had written in the cave. "I am not ready to die here." He read it for a long time. Then he turned to a fresh page and began to write, not the spare, operational notes he had made during the ordeal. Those entries had been functional documents, inventory and weather reports, the minimum language required to keep a record. What he wrote now was something different. He wrote about Margaret, not her death. He had been writing around her death for 3 years, circling it in his journal the way a man circles a fire that is too hot to approach directly. But her life. The specific, concrete details of it. The tin mug and the morning light. The books she had read aloud. The sound of her voice on winter evenings. The way she had argued with him about the property line. Not the Calloway-Haas property line, but their own. The first summer on the mountain, when they had disagreed about where to build the root cellar, and Margaret had been right and had declined, with characteristic grace, to say so afterward. He wrote about her for 2 hours, until the fire had burned low and Thomas was stirring in his chair. Then he closed the journal and lay looking at the ceiling and felt something that was not the sharp, lacerating grief of 3 years ago, but was quieter and more complex. A grief that had changed shape, that had sat in the cave with him for 11 days and come out the other side of something. He did not have a name for what it had come out the other side of. He was not a man who required names for things. He only knew that the cabin on the upper fork of the Cheat River, the cabin he had retreated into like a wound retreating into scar tissue, did not feel, when he imagined it now, like somewhere he needed to return to. That was new. And it was, he recognized slowly, lying in the borrowed room with the fire burning low, and Thomas Reed asleep in the chair. Important. Chapter 5. The Man Who Came Back. Spring came late to the Appalachians in 1780, as it always does after a hard winter. Cautiously, incrementally, testing its welcome with a few warm days, followed by a week of cold, then 2 warm days, then a late snowfall that seemed like an argument before it melted, and the argument was settled. The creek that had nearly killed Elias came down from the ridge in a roar of snowmelt that the settlement could hear from their cabins, a sound like continuous low thunder that lasted 3 weeks and then subsided into the ordinary voice of moving water. By April, Elias Croft was well enough to walk without assistance. The right hand had settled into its new configuration, 3 fingers. The remaining ones stiffened at the middle joints by the scar tissue that had formed around them. The hand as a whole capable of gripping and holding, but not of the fine, responsive work it had once done. He had expected this, and had already begun, in the weeks of his recovery, to retrain. He practiced knots with his left hand, using a length of rope Thomas Reed had left in the room, working through the sequence of hitches and bends and loops from the simplest to the most complex, hour after hour, until his left hand knew them as fluently as his right had once known them. He practiced with the knife, cutting, cleaning, the precise work of skinning, left-handed, slowly, then faster, until the motion began to feel less like translation and more like language. He adapted. It was what he did. What was less expected, less planned for, less susceptible to the discipline of practice, was what was happening in the larger frame of his life. William Reed had offered him a plot of land at the settlement's edge in late February, when it became clear that Elias's recovery was going to be measured in months rather than weeks. The offer had been made in William's characteristic manner, straightforward, practical, without excess sentiment. There's a clearing on the east side of the meadow. Good drainage, sun from mid-morning on, close enough to hear if something needs hearing. It's yours, if you want it. Elias had said he would think about it. He had thought about it for 6 weeks, which in Elias Croft terms was a relatively rapid deliberation. The cabin on the upper fork of the Cheat River was still there. He had sent Thomas up to check on it in March, when the trail became passable, and the boy had reported back that it was intact, the roof holding, the stores undisturbed. It was available to him. He could go back to it. He could resume the life he had been living before November 17th. The trapping, the solitude, the long stretches of days that passed with nothing to mark them but weather and work. He sat with the possibility, honestly. He did not dismiss it, and he did not romanticize it. He looked at it clearly, the way he looked at a piece of terrain he was considering crossing, where it would hold his weight and where it would not, what it offered and what it cost, what lay on the far side of it. What he saw, looking at it clearly, was a man who had been disappearing, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, incrementally, over 3 years of withdrawal and self-imposed distance. He had been making himself smaller, contracting into the cabin, the ridge, the solitary routines that required nothing of him emotionally and asked nothing from anyone else. He had told himself it was grief. It had been grief at first. But grief, if you let it, will build you a house and tell you it's a home. And Elias had been living in that house long enough that he had stopped noticing the walls. The cave had taken the walls away. 11 days of absolute solitude, real solitude, the kind that does not choose you but is imposed on you, that has nothing romantic or deliberate about it. That is simply the condition of being alone and cold and possibly dying, had shown him the difference between solitude chosen as armor and solitude as the actual state of being without other people. He had not liked the second kind. He had not realized, until he experienced it without the armor, how much the armor had cost him. He told William Reed yes. They broke ground in May, when the frost was fully out of the soil and the days were long enough to work from early morning to late evening. William Reed and his 2 sons came on the first day, and Thomas was there, and Robert Haas and 3 other men from the settlement. Men Elias had exchanged perhaps 50 words with collectively over the previous 3 years, who arrived with axes and adzes and a willingness to work that asked nothing of him, except that he show up. He showed up. The work was different with one fully functional hand. He had accepted this and planned for it. He worked the jobs that suited his current capacities, letting others take the tasks that required 2 strong hands, and he did not make it a source of drama or apology. He was useful. Not as useful as he had once been. Not in the ways he had once been useful, but useful in the ways available to him, which was enough. What surprised him was how much he did not mind the company. He had expected to find it tiring, the presence of people, the noise of conversation and work, and the particular social friction of a group of men doing physical labor together. The jokes he did not always follow and the references to shared history he had not been part of. He had expected to endure it, to be grateful for the help while privately counting the hours until he could be alone again. Instead, he found himself listening to the work talk and the weather talk and William Reed's long, digressive story about the bear that had gotten into the Callaway root cellar the previous autumn, and the way Thomas laughed at the end of it, openly, fully, without self-consciousness. He found himself responding, occasionally, short answers, factual contributions, once or twice something that made William Reed laugh with a surprise that he did not try to hide. By the end of the first week of building, Elias Croft had said more words to more people than he had spoken in the preceding year. He noted this in his journal without extensive commentary. Good progress on the cabin. William Reed tells a long story, but ends it well. Thomas works harder than men twice his age. I am not as solitary as I believed. Dorothea came to see the cabin's progress on a Saturday in late June, when the walls were up and the roof framing was in place, and the structure was recognizable as what it would become. She walked through the framed interior with the assessing attention she brought to everything, noting the placement of the fireplace, the orientation of the windows, the elevation of the floor above the surrounding ground that would keep it dry in wet seasons. "You've put the window facing east," she said. "Morning light," Elias said. "Margaret always said—" He stopped. Dorothea waited. She was good at waiting. It was, she had discovered over years of practice, one of the most useful things a person could do. She always said the morning light was the honest light, he finished. That a room looked like what it was in the morning, couldn't hide anything. She was right, Dorothea said. They stood in the framed east wall's gap where the window would be and looked out at the meadow in the morning light. The grass coming in green after the long winter, the creek visible at the meadow's far edge, the mountains rising beyond it, in the particular blue that they turned in summer, distant and permanent and indifferent to everything that happened in their shadow. "I've been thinking about her more," Elias said. "Since the cave. I don't know why exactly." You'd think the other way," Dorothea said. "You'd think nearly dying would make you want to think less about the person you lost." "Yes. I think it's the opposite. I think when everything else strips away, what's left is what actually mattered." He considered that for a moment with the same careful attention he gave to everything. "Yes," he said again. "That's it exactly." It was the longest personal conversation Elias Croft had initiated in 3 years. Dorothea noted this with the internal attention she kept carefully internal, said nothing about it, and asked him about the roof framing instead. They talked about the roof for 20 minutes, and then she walked back to the settlement, and she did not let herself think too specifically about the conversation until she was home and the door was closed, at which point she sat down at her table and permitted herself a small, private acknowledgement that something had shifted, and that the shifting had been a long time coming, and that she was, cautiously and specifically, glad. The cabin was finished in August. On the day he moved in, which consisted of carrying his few possessions from the Reed cabin to the new one, a process that took 1 trip and 40 minutes, Thomas Reed appeared at the door with a gift. A small iron hook, hand-forged by the settlement's blacksmith, designed to hang from the fireplace lintel and hold a pot. Father said every new cabin needs something made by someone else's hands, Thomas said, so it knows it belongs to the community. Elias looked at the hook for a moment. Then he took it with his left hand, because it was easier, and turned it over once, feeling the weight and workmanship of it. "Thank your father," he said, and then, "Thank you for the mountain." Thomas Reed looked at him steadily. He was 18 now, nearly a man, already carrying himself with the particular quiet confidence that physical courage produces in young people who don't yet know to be afraid of it. "You came out on your own," Thomas said. "I just called your name." Elias hung the hook on the lintel and did not answer because Thomas was not wrong. He had come out on his own legs, in his own stubborn refusal. But he was also not entirely right, and the distinction mattered in a way that Elias was still working out how to articulate. He had come out on his own legs, but he had come toward something, and the something had made the difference. He would write about it later, in the journal, in the way he wrote about most things that mattered, plainly, without embellishment, in the small hours of the morning when the fire had burned to coals, and the mountain outside was quiet, and the words came out more honestly than they did in daylight. He and Dorothea Marsh were married in October of 1781, 14 months after he moved into the new cabin. It had been a courtship conducted almost entirely in practical terms. Conversations about medicine and woodcraft and the settlement's preparations for winter, meals shared at the Reed family's table, and then at Dorothea's table, and then at Elias's, the gradual unannounced accumulation of presents that constitutes intimacy between people who are not given to announcement. There had been no dramatic declaration. There had been an evening in September when they were sitting by Elias's fire after supper, both of them reading. She had lent him 2 of her books, and he had read them with the focused attention of a man making up for lost time. And Dorothea had looked up from her page and said, with the directness that was her most fundamental characteristic, "I think we should get married." Elias had looked up from his book. "I think so too," he said. That was the entirety of the proposal. The ceremony was held on a clear October morning in the open space between the settlement's cabins. Most of Harrow's Creek was present, 30 families, more than 100 people, gathered in the cold morning air with the particular expression of a community that has collectively decided something good has happened and deserves acknowledgement. Agnes Boone, who had brought the bean soup and the silence, stood in the second row and cried quietly, which she would have denied under any questioning. Thomas Reed was there, standing straight in his good coat, watching with an expression of uncomplicated satisfaction. Elias stood before the gathering and prepared to speak. He was not comfortable with public speech. He never had been, and the years of solitude had not improved the skill. But Dorothea was standing beside him, and the morning was clear, and the mountains were blue in the distance, and the people in front of him were people who had sent their sons into a blizzard to find him, who had brought soup and firewood and ham and left them without ceremony at a door, who had built his cabin with their hands and asked nothing in return except that he show up. He owed them more than silence. "I am not a man of many words," he said. His voice was steady. "But I have learned, at considerable cost, that silence is not the same as strength." He paused. "I am grateful to be here. I am grateful to all of you." It was the longest public speech anyone in Harrow's Creek had ever heard him give. In the back of the gathering, someone started clapping. By the second beat, everyone had joined. Elias Croft lived for another 23 years after the winter of 1779. He and Dorothea had 2 children, a son, born in 1783, and a daughter in 1786. He continued trapping and hunting, adapted to his modified hand with the thoroughness that characterized everything he did, and became, over the years, what he had never expected to become, a man that people came to. for practical help, for quiet counsel, for the specific kind of company that a person who has been through something and come out the other side provides, a presence that communicates, without words, that difficulty is survivable. He died in the autumn of 1803, at 66, in the cabin with the east-facing window. Dorothea was with him. His son and daughter were there. Thomas Reed, who was 41 and had a family of his own and a farm on the lower meadow, came and sat with them through the last day. The journal, 30 years of entries, from the operational notes of a solitary trapper to something larger and more honest, was found in a cedar chest by his grandchildren, wrapped in oilcloth, the leather cover worn smooth from handling. They read it by firelight, passing it between them, the handwriting changing across the decades, from the spare, abbreviated style of the early years to something fuller and more patient in the later ones, as though the man writing had gradually decided that the full account was worth giving. On the last page, written in the steady hand of a man who had outlasted everything that had tried to finish him, was a single sentence, placed there not as an epitaph, but as a conclusion, the final entry in an honest accounting. The mountain does not forgive, but it does sometimes give back.